Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Securitas depot robbery of 2006. It is a story of absolute precision and terrifying deception, a night where the boundaries between safety and danger were blurred by a single flash of light. Imagine, if you will, the quiet weight of a Tuesday evening in late February. The air in Kent is sharp, carrying the lingering dampness of a winter that refuses to let go. The sky has deepened into a bruised purple, a heavy indigo blanket that settles over the rolling hills and the winding arteries of the English countryside. For most, this is a time of transition, the slow movement from the demands of the office to the warmth of the hearth. But for one man, this mundane commute would become the threshold of a nightmare that would rewrite the history of crime in the United Kingdom. Take a breath, and let the rhythm of the road carry you back to that cold Tuesday, the 21st of February, 2006. Colin Dixon is a man of routine and responsibility. As the manager of the Securitas cash depot in Tonbridge, he is the keeper of millions. His world is one of reinforced steel, biometric scanners, and the constant, silent hum of security cameras. It is a world where every penny is accounted for and every door is locked. On this evening, just after 6 o'clock, he finally turns his key in the lock of his office and steps out into the crisp night air. He climbs into his silver Nissan Almera, a sensible, unremarkable car that mirrors the steady nature of his life. As he pulls away from the depot, he feels the familiar fatigue of a long day. He sends a quick text to his wife, Lynn, letting her know he is finally on his way home to Herne Bay. He is looking forward to seeing her and their 9-year-old son, Craig. The heater in the Nissan begins to hum, pushing back the chill, as he merges onto the A249 near Stockbury. The world outside the glass is a blur of passing headlights and the steady, rhythmic clicking of the indicators. The A249 is a vein of asphalt cutting through the darkness, illuminated by the occasional overhead glow of sodium lamps that cast a sickly, orange light onto the road. Colin is driving steadily, his mind perhaps drifting toward the evening meal or the quiet domesticity waiting for him at the end of the journey. But then, a flicker of movement in his rearview mirror catches his attention. A car has appeared behind him, closing the distance with professional intent. Suddenly, the darkness is pierced by the sharp, rhythmic pulse of blue lights. They are small, intense, and mounted behind the front grille of a dark Volvo S60. Colin's heart does not race yet. Instead, there is only the instinctive compliance of a law-abiding citizen. He assumes it is an unmarked police vehicle. He checks his speedometer, wondering if he had inadvertently pushed past the limit in his eagerness to get home. With a sigh of resignation, he begins to slow down, the tires of the Nissan crunching onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The blue lights continue to dance against the dashboard of his car, a frantic, silent rhythm that feels increasingly out of place in the quiet Kent night. The Volvo pulls in front of him, boxing him in against the verge. 2 men step out. They are dressed in the unmistakable attire of the police. One wears a high-visibility yellow jacket that seems to vibrate under the glare of the headlights. Their movements are clipped, authoritative, and perfectly practiced. As one of the men approaches the driver's side window, Colin rolls down the glass. The air that rushes in is freezing, smelling of wet earth and exhaust fumes. The man speaks with a tone of calm authority, informing Colin that he is being stopped for several speeding offenses. It is a plausible lie, delivered with the flat, professional cadence of a traffic officer. Colin is confused, perhaps a bit frustrated, but he does not suspect a trap. He is told to turn off his engine and leave his keys in the ignition. Protocol is being broken, but the presence of the uniform and the blue lights acts as a powerful sedative to his intuition. He steps out of the Nissan, his breath blooming in white clouds before him, and he is led toward the back of the Volvo. The door is opened, and he is asked to step inside for questioning. It is the last moment of his life that will ever feel normal. As soon as the door of the Volvo clicks shut, the atmosphere undergoes a violent, chilling transformation. The professional courtesy of the officers vanishes, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Before Colin can even settle into the seat, he is roughly seized. Metal teeth bite into his wrists as handcuffs are snapped into place with a series of sharp, mechanical clicks. The weight of the situation begins to press down on him like a physical burden. He looks at the men, searching for the badge, for the identification, but he is told only that it is back at the station. The driver puts the Volvo into gear and pulls away, but he does not drive like a police officer. He accelerates with an erratic, aggressive energy, and the radio in the car is not a police frequency, but the upbeat, jarring sounds of Radio 1. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Colin asks again to see their identification, his voice trembling now. The man in the passenger seat turns around, and the mask finally slips. He tells Colin, with a terrifying lack of emotion, that they are not policemen. He warns him not to do anything silly, or someone will get hurt. To emphasize the point, a 9mm handgun is produced, its dark, heavy barrel catching the passing light. The blue lights of the Volvo are switched off, and Colin Dixon is swallowed by the shadows. The car journeys through the dark for what feels like an eternity, though it is only a few minutes. They pull over in a secluded area on the West Malling bypass, where the Volvo is met by a white van. The transition is swift and brutal. Colin is moved from the car to the back of the van, his legs bound with tape, his eyes covered so that the world becomes nothing but sounds and the sensation of movement. He is no longer a manager, no longer a husband, no longer a father. He is a key. He is being transported to Elderton Farm near Staplehurst, a remote location that has been prepared as a cage for the coming hours. As the van bounces over uneven ground, Colin's mind races to his wife and son, unaware that at that very moment, another pair of men in police uniforms is knocking on the door of his home in Herne Bay. The betrayal of the blue lights was only the beginning. The night is young, the air is cold, and the largest heist in history has just begun its slow, terrifying crawl toward the dawn. Lie still now, as the weight of the story settles. We are only just beginning to see what lies beneath the surface of this winter night. In the coastal town of Herne Bay, the evening of the 21st of February, 2006, began like any other for Lynn Dixon and her young son, Craig. The air was chilled with the heavy dampness of the English winter, a thick mist clinging to the cold glass of the windows in their home. Inside, the lights were warm and golden, the familiar, comforting sounds of a quiet Tuesday night providing a deceptive sense of safety. Colin was late, but that was not unusual for a man in his position, managing the vast flows of currency at the Securitas depot in Tonbridge. Lynn moved through the house with a gentle rhythm, perhaps tidying a few toys or helping her son with his evening schoolwork, entirely unaware that the quiet of their suburban neighborhood was being watched from the shadows. The street outside was bathed in the orange, flickering glow of sodium lamps, casting long, wavering shadows across the wet pavement. It was a scene of utter domestic normalcy, a sanctuary of family life that was about to be shattered by a single, authoritative knock at the front door. When the knock came, it was not the frantic pounding of a stranger, but the measured, rhythmic rap of the law. Two men stood on the doorstep, dressed in the dark, instantly recognizable uniforms of the police. One of them wore a high-visibility jacket that caught the dim light of the hallway, creating an illusion of official protection. They spoke with a calm, professional tone that immediately bypassed Lynn's natural defenses. They told her there had been a terrible accident. They claimed that Colin, her husband, had been involved in a serious crash on his way home. The panic that rose in her chest was sharp and immediate, a cold blade of fear that made it impossible for her to think clearly or question the men's identities. They urged her to hurry, saying they needed to take her and her son to the hospital right away to be by his side. In the rush of adrenaline and overwhelming worry, Lynn grabbed a heavy coat and her 8-year-old son, ushering the confused boy into the back of the waiting car. She trusted the uniform. She trusted the badge. In her distress, she did not notice the subtle, strange imperfections. The way the mustache on one officer seemed slightly too stiff, or the way the car, though equipped with blue lights in the grille, lacked the standard markings of a Kent patrol vehicle. The car pulled away from the curb, moving smoothly through the quiet streets of Herne Bay and heading out toward the darker, more isolated roads that cut through the heart of the countryside. For the first few minutes, the silence inside the vehicle was heavy with Lynn's unspoken prayers and the soft breathing of her son. But as the minutes stretched toward an hour, the direction they were traveling began to feel profoundly wrong. They were not heading toward any major hospital. The polite, professional demeanor of the men in the front seats began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, predatory stillness that filled the small cabin. It was on a dark, desolate stretch of road, far from the safety of any town, that the charade finally ended. The man in the passenger seat turned around, and the silver glint of a handgun caught the passing moonlight. The words he spoke were short and chilling, designed to paralyze any thought of resistance. They were not police officers, and they were not taking her to see a husband in a hospital bed. They were taking her into the heart of a violent conspiracy. The realization hit Lynn like a physical blow, her primary instinct shifting instantly to the small, frightened boy sitting beside her in the darkness, whose hand she gripped with a strength born of pure terror. Somewhere in the deep, freezing shadows of the Kent countryside, the car came to a stop at a secluded lay-by. It was here that Colin Dixon, already held captive and trembling, was forced to witness the ultimate leverage the gang held over him. A second vehicle arrived, its headlights cutting through the thick mist like twin blades. As the doors were pulled open, Colin saw the pale, terrified faces of his wife and son. The sight was a devastating blow to his resolve, a moment of total emotional collapse. One of the captors, a man whose face was hidden behind a mask and whose voice was a low, menacing rasp, made the stakes of the night perfectly clear. He stepped toward the child and pressed the cold, hard muzzle of a firearm against the boy's head. The psychological terror was absolute. There were no more questions about whether Colin would cooperate. There was only the desperate, heart-wrenching need to keep his family alive at any cost. The air in the lane was freezing, the scent of damp earth and biting exhaust fumes mingling in the darkness. But the cold Colin felt was internal, a bone-deep shiver of total vulnerability and helplessness. The family was eventually moved to a remote and lonely location known as Elderton Farm, a sprawling property near Staplehurst that felt like the very edge of the world. The farm was a labyrinth of shadows, outbuildings, and dark corners, isolated from any prying eyes by long, winding tracks and dense thickets of winter-stripped trees. They were taken to a cold outbuilding where the atmosphere was thick with the smell of old wood, rusted metal, and the damp chill of the earth. The gang members moved around them with a disciplined, frightening efficiency, their masks turning them into faceless monsters in the flickering, low light of the shed. For hours, the Dixons were held in this terrifying limbo, the silence of the rural night broken only by the sharp, metallic clicks of weapons being readied, or the low, urgent murmurs of the men planning the next phase of their heist. The captors played expertly on the family's terror, reminding them constantly that their lives were forfeit if a single mistake was made, or if Colin hesitated for even a second. Every time the young boy whimpered or Lynn tried to whisper a word of comfort to him, the threat was renewed with a subtle, menacing gesture of a gun. It was a slow-motion trauma, a psychological siege designed to break Colin's spirit entirely before they forced him to drive toward the depot. The night was far from over. And as the clock ticked toward 1 in the morning, the true scale of the horror they were being forced into was only just beginning to unfold into the largest robbery in history. The air at Elderton Farm was thick with a biting winter mist as the clocks struck 1 in the morning on Wednesday, February 22nd, 2006. The transition from the isolation of the farm to the cold reality of the mission was marked by the heavy, mechanical hum of engines idling in the dark. Colin Dixon sat in the back of a Vauxhall Vectra, his hands still bound, his mind fractured by the impossible weight of what he was being forced to do. Behind his vehicle sat a dark Volvo S60, its blue grille lights now extinguished, and a massive 7.5-ton white Renault Midland lorry. This convoy, a surreal procession of shadow and steel, began its crawl out of the farm gates and onto the quiet, sleeping roads of Kent. The journey toward Tonbridge was a silent one, the only sound being the tires whispering against the damp asphalt and the occasional rattle of the heavy lorry following closely behind. For Colin, every mile felt like a descent further into a nightmare from which there was no waking. As they approached Vale Road in Tonbridge, the industrial landscape began to rise out of the fog like a series of monoliths. The Securitas depot was not just a building. It was a fortress, a bunker-style facility designed to keep the world out and the riches of the Bank of England in. It sat beneath the glare of high-intensity floodlights that cast long, harsh shadows across the perimeter fences. At 1:21 in the morning, the Volvo and the Vectra pulled toward the entrance. To any outside observer, it might have looked like a routine police escort or a late shift arrival. The robbers knew that the strength of this fortress lay in its layers of technology, but they also knew that every layer had a single point of failure, the human element. Colin was that point. He was the human key, the only individual who could navigate the electronic labyrinth without triggering the silent alarms that would bring the weight of the law down upon them in minutes. One of the men, still dressed in the crisp, authoritative uniform of a police officer, stepped out of the vehicle and pulled Colin with him. The cold air hit Colin's face, sharp and unforgiving. He was led toward the pedestrian entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Beside him, the disguised intruder maintained a posture of professional calm, a performance meant for the cameras watching from above. Colin reached for his security swipe card. The plastic felt cold and alien in his trembling fingers. He held it up to the reader, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. A soft, electronic beep cut through the silence, followed by the heavy, metallic clunk of the magnetic lock disengaging. It was the sound of the fortress yielding. Colin then pressed the buzzer for the control room, his face illuminated by the harsh white glow of the intercom camera. Inside the climate-controlled silence of the monitoring station, Gary Barclay was working the night shift. He looked up at the grainy monitor and saw a familiar sight. His manager, Colin Dixon, standing at the gate with a police officer. In the sterile environment of a high-security vault, there is a protocol for everything, yet the presence of the law often brings a sense of compliance that bypasses suspicion. Seeing the uniform, Gary didn't hesitate. He reached for the control panel and pressed the button to release the main gate. The heavy steel barriers began to slide open with a low, grinding groan, creating a gap just wide enough for the convoy to enter. As the white Renault lorry rolled into the loading bay, the trap was officially sprung. The illusion of safety that had protected the 14 staff members inside was about to evaporate, replaced by the terrifying sight of masked men wielding AK-47s and Scorpion submachine guns. The breach was instantaneous and overwhelming. The gang moved with a practiced, military precision, fanning out across the depot floor. The 14 employees, who had been going about their mundane tasks of sorting and counting currency, were suddenly confronted by a vision of violence. One supervisor, Melanie Sampson, initially thought it was a training exercise, a test of their readiness. But that thought vanished the moment she felt the cold steel of a shotgun barrel against her skin and heard the harsh commands to lie face down on the linoleum. The floor was freezing, the scent of industrial cleaner and ozone filling their senses as they were bound with plastic cable ties. One by one, the staff members were led to the very cages that were meant to hold the cash. They were locked inside the steel mesh, forced to watch as the robbers turned their attention to the main vault, a cavernous space filled with millions of pounds in used and unused banknotes. The sight inside the vault was staggering, a literal sea of money stacked in neat bricks of paper. There were 53 million pounds sitting there, a king's ransom waiting to be claimed. The robbers didn't use sophisticated tools to move the loot. They used what was available. They grabbed shopping trolleys and heavy metal cages, the wheels squeaking loudly in the vast, echoing space as they began to ferry the cash toward the waiting Renault lorry. The physical labor was intense. Each bundle of cash was heavy, a dense brick of history and value. They worked with a frantic energy, knowing that every second they spent inside the fortress was a second closer to discovery. Colin watched from his own position of captivity, seeing his life's work at the depot being dismantled in a matter of minutes. The air was filled with the sound of rustling plastic, the clatter of trolleys, and the muffled shouts of the gunmen as they realized just how much money was actually within their reach. Inside the Securitas depot in Tonbridge, the silence of the night had been replaced by a clinical, high-stakes efficiency. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, persistent buzz, casting a pale and flickering glow across the expansive warehouse floor. 14 staff members, along with the manager's wife and young son, were forced to lie face down on the unforgiving concrete. Their hands were pulled behind their backs, the biting grip of industrial plastic cable ties cinching tight around their wrists. The sound of those ties zipping shut, a sharp, plastic rasp, repeated 14 times, each one punctuating the terrifying reality of their situation. The hostages were eventually moved into the very steel cages meant for the money, transformed into human cargo as the robbers turned their attention to the vault. The air felt thin, heavy with the collective breath of 20 people caught in a moment that would change the history of British crime forever. The sight that awaited the gang inside the vault was beyond comprehension. It was not just a room, it was a cathedral of currency. Stacks upon stacks of used and unused banknotes reached toward the ceiling, creating a monochromatic landscape of paper. There were 53,116,760 pounds waiting to be claimed. This was not the abstract wealth of a digital bank transfer or a number on a computer screen. This was the physical, crushing weight of currency. The robbers began the grueling, manual process of moving this fortune from the vault to the loading bay, where the 7.5-ton white Renault truck sat. Its engine was idling with a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floor, a mechanical heartbeat waiting for the treasure to be loaded into its belly. The physical labor required for the heist was immense. The gang utilized the depot's own tools, including a forklift and heavy-duty trolleys, to ferry 17 large metal cages filled with cash across the warehouse. The wheels of the trolleys squeaked and groaned under the weight, a sound that echoed off the high metal walls like a high-pitched cry. Each cage was packed to the brim with plastic-wrapped bricks of notes, mostly 20 and 50-pound denominations. The air in the depot grew thick with the smell of ink and old paper, mixed with the faint, oily scent of the forklift's hydraulic fluid. The men worked with a desperate intensity, their breath coming in heavy, visible plumes in the cold February air. Every movement had to be precise and deliberate, as the clock was ticking toward the early hours of the morning, and the window of opportunity was slowly closing. As the back of the Renault truck began to fill, the space inside became a cramped, claustrophobic labyrinth of money. The robbers had to push the cages deeper into the dark interior, their muscles straining against the inertia of the massive load. It is estimated that the amount they took weighed nearly 2 tons. Imagine the sheer effort required to lift, push, and stack 2 tons of paper in the dead of night, while wearing heavy balaclavas that restricted their vision and made their faces flush with heat. Despite their extensive preparation, the sheer magnitude of the treasure presented a logistical nightmare that they had to solve in real time. They were no longer just thieves. They had become manual laborers in a factory of wealth, moving a Herculean weight cage by cage. Outside the loading bay, the world was still and dark, completely unaware that the largest cash heist in British history was unfolding within these walls. The driver of the truck watched the side mirrors, the white paint of the vehicle reflecting the dim security lights of the depot. Every few minutes, another cage would be slammed into the cargo hold, the metallic bang of steel on steel echoing through the night. The robbers were intensely focused, driven by the knowledge that every second they remained on the premises was a dangerous gamble with their freedom. They moved with a practiced synchronization, a dark choreography born of months of meticulous planning and surveillance. Each man knew his role, yet the sheer volume of the cash was enough to overwhelm even the most disciplined mind. However, even with their 7.5-ton truck, they soon realized they had reached a physical limit. The vault still contained a staggering £154 million, a sum far greater than what they had already loaded. The floor of the truck was covered, the cages were stacked to the ceiling, and there was simply no more room to breathe, let alone store more cash. They had to make the agonizing decision to leave behind more than triple what they were taking. It was a rare moment in criminal history where the haul was so vast, it exceeded the capacity of the getaway vehicle. The remaining millions sat in the vault, silent and untouched, as the gang prepared to make their final exit from the depot. At approximately 2:44 in the morning, the heavy rear doors of the Renault truck were swung shut and locked. The sound of the latch clicking into place was a signal of completion. One of the robbers, perhaps caught in a moment of adrenaline-fueled irony, paused to thank the terrified staff for their cooperation. He warned them not to move, a chilling reminder that the gang knew where they lived and would not hesitate to return. Then, the engine of the truck roared as the driver shifted into gear. The massive vehicle pulled away from the loading bay, its tires visibly compressed under the weight of £53 million. It rolled out of the depot and disappeared into the shadows of the Kent countryside, leaving behind a scene of quiet trauma and a vault still overflowing with abandoned riches that no one could carry. The heavy rumble of the white Renault truck faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. In the cavernous depot at Tonbridge, the air was thick with the scent of diesel exhaust and the sharp, metallic tang of the massive vault. The exhaust fumes curled like ghosts toward the high ceilings, illuminated briefly by the flickering fluorescent lights above. For hours, this space had been filled with the frantic sounds of a forklift and the rhythmic, aggressive thud of cash-filled cages being slammed into the back of a lorry. Now, at 2:44 in the morning, that industry had ceased. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a ringing, breathless stillness that seemed to vibrate against the high corrugated walls. The robbers were gone, vanished into the damp Kent night, but their presence lingered in every shadow and in the terrified hearts of those they left behind. Inside the facility, 14 staff members, along with the manager's wife and their young son, remained where they had been forced. Locked inside the cold, steel mesh cages typically reserved for storing millions of pounds in banknotes. These enclosures, designed to keep currency safe from the world, were now serving as a makeshift prison for the innocent. Each person was a statue of forced compliance, eyes darting to the exits. The floor was hard, cold concrete, and the texture of the metal mesh pressed against their skin through their thin uniforms. Many were bound with thick, white plastic cable ties that bit into their wrists with every movement. The plastic was smooth and unforgiving, and the sound of it sliding against itself, a sharp, zip-like noise, was the only thing that dared to break the quiet as people shifted their weight in the dark. The cold air of the warehouse began to seep through their clothing, making the weight even more grueling. The fear was thick, an invisible fog that filled the lungs of everyone in the vault. Before departing, one of the gunmen had leaned in close, the scent of sweat and fear clinging to his mask, and delivered a chilling warning. They told the staff they knew where they lived. They promised that if anyone moved too soon, if anyone called for help before the truck had cleared the county, there would be consequences for their families. This psychological shackle was more effective than any physical binding. For a long time, no one spoke. They only listened to the settling of the building, the hum of the overhead lights, and the ragged, synchronized breathing of 15 people trying to be invisible in a room made of glass and steel. Every creak of the building sounded like a returning footstep, keeping them frozen in place long after the getaway vehicle had vanished into the 2006 night. Among the captives was the manager's young son, a child of only 7 or 8 years. In the stillness of the vault, his small presence became a beacon of hope for the traumatized adults. The bars of the cash cages, meant to prevent a human hand from reaching through to grab bundles of sterling, were wide enough for a small, lithe child to navigate. With a courage that far outstripped his years, the boy managed to squeeze his way through the narrow gaps in the metal mesh. It was a slow, delicate process, the sound of his clothing brushing against the cold steel, the soft scuff of his shoes on the floor. Once on the outside, he was able to help his mother and the other staff members. One employee, with a presence of mind that defied the trauma of the night, had managed to retain a key or found the means to reach the locks. The metallic click of the cage's opening felt like the first breath after being underwater. It was 3:15 in the morning by the time they felt safe enough to act. The wait had been agonizing, 31 minutes of checking the shadows and listening for the return of the gunmen. When the alarm was finally triggered, it wasn't a loud, clanging bell, but a silent signal that raced through the telephone lines to the police headquarters. The staff remained huddled together, the shock finally beginning to set in. They looked at the floor, which was littered with discarded cable ties and the remnants of the robbers' presence. The vault, which had been a fortress of wealth just hours before, now felt like a hollowed-out shell, stripped of its purpose and its security. They sat in the shadows of the remaining money, waiting for the blue lights that would signal their true liberation. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene that defied their training. The Securitas depot was known to be one of the most secure buildings in the country, a place deemed almost impregnable. The officers stepped through the heavy doors, their boots clicking on the polished floors, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. They expected a struggle, or perhaps a failed attempt. Instead, they were met by a group of people who were physically unhurt but profoundly traumatized. The officers' breath hitched as they entered the main vault area. The most striking sight was the emptiness. 17 metal cages and 3 trolleys, which had been filled to the brim with banknotes, were gone. The robbers had stolen almost 53 million pounds, but they had been forced to leave behind more than 154 million pounds simply because their truck was too full. The sheer scale of the theft was laid bare in the gaps of the remaining stacks. The cages stood like skeletons in the center of the room, their doors swinging open, reflecting the blue and red flashes of the sirens outside. The air in Kent was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke as the sun climbed slowly over the horizon on the morning of Friday, the 24th of February, 2006. For the investigators of the Kent police, the quiet countryside had become a sprawling map of secrets. They were looking for the ghosts of a heist that had shaken the very foundations of the British banking system. The first significant discovery came at the Hook and Hatchet pub in the tiny village of Hucking. There, Sitting in the shadow of the ancient trees was a van painted with the familiar red and white livery of Parcel Force. To any passerby, it looked like a routine delivery vehicle, perhaps waiting for a driver to return from a morning tea. But as the forensic teams approached, the silence surrounding the vehicle felt heavy, charged with the residue of a crime that was only just beginning to reveal its true scale. While the team in Hucking began their slow, rhythmic documentation, another call came through from the car park of the Ashford International Hotel. A white Ford Transit van had been left there, seemingly invisible in the coming and going of travelers. When the officers opened the rear doors, the air inside was stale, smelling of cold metal and heavy oil. What they found inside was a jarring contrast to the mundane setting. Tucked away were two large bags, and as the zippers were pulled back, the pale morning light fell upon stacks of stolen banknotes totaling more than £1.3 million. Beside the cash lay the tools of a violent trade: a Scorpion submachine gun, a discarded balaclava, and a heavy bulletproof vest. It was as if the occupants had simply evaporated, leaving behind a fortune and the steel evidence of their intent, a breadcrumb trail left for a team that was now working against the clock. Not far from the historic stones of Leeds Castle, the investigation took a darker, more visceral turn. In a narrow, winding lane, the skeleton of a Volvo S60 was discovered. It was no longer the sleek, silver vehicle that had been used to intercept the depot manager just nights before. Now, it was a blackened husk, the paint blistered and peeled away by intense heat. The smell of scorched plastic and rubber hung in the air, a pungent reminder of the gang's attempt to erase their passage. Forensic officers knelt in the ash, their gloved hands moving with infinite patience. They were searching for what the fire might have missed: a fragment of a tooth, a melted button, or perhaps a signature of the accelerant used to start the blaze. Every inch of the charred interior was a puzzle piece, a silent witness to the moment the criminals decided to burn their bridge back to the world they once knew. As the day progressed, the fleet continued to materialize across the county. A red Vauxhall Vectra was located nearby, another piece of the masquerade that had allowed the group to impersonate the law. But the most significant vessel of all was still being sought: the 7.5-ton Renault Midland truck that had groaned under the weight of £53 million. Eventually, the trail led to a hire center and subsequently to the sprawling acreage of Elderton Farm. Here, the investigation transformed into a massive operation. The truck, once a mountain of moving currency, was now an empty cavern of white metal. The forensic teams moved in, setting up portable lights that hummed softly in the rural quiet. They were looking for the minute, the invisible, and the overlooked. They searched the floorboards and the loading lift, hoping to find a single fiber from a balaclava or a stray hair that could link the steel to a human face. Inside the controlled environment of the forensic tents, the work was a study in stillness. The investigators worked in a world of soft brushes and fine powders. They applied magnetic flakes to the steering wheels and door handles, watching as the hidden geometry of a fingerprint bloomed into view against the surface. It was a painstaking process, requiring a level of focus that blocked out the growing media circus beyond the police tape. They were not just looking for prints, they were hunting for DNA. In 2006, the science of genetic mapping was a powerful weapon. A single drop of sweat on a discarded mask or a skin cell caught in the weave of a seat cover could provide a name. Every swab taken was a potential key to a door that the gang thought they had locked behind them, a silent whisper from the evidence that would eventually speak volumes in a courtroom. The discovery of the abandoned fleet marked a turning point in the hunt. The gang had moved with military precision, yet they had left behind a trail of steel and glass that stretched across the heart of Kent. Each vehicle was a chapter of the robbery, from the initial kidnapping in the Volvo to the massive transport in the Renault truck. The discarded cages and the scattered packaging found in the fields near Dettling Hill added to the picture of a group that was beginning to buckle under the sheer physical weight of their prize. They had stolen so much that they had been forced to leave millions behind, and in their haste, they had left these mechanical witnesses to tell their story. As the sun began to set on the fields of Elderton Farm, the investigators knew the net was finally starting to tighten. The shadows were growing long, but for the first time since the heist began, the light of forensic science was beginning to cut through the darkness. The winter air of February 2006 remained biting and sharp as the investigation into the Securitas heist shifted its weight. It was no longer just a hunt for a missing truck or a primary crime scene. It had become a pursuit of ghosts and shadows. The initial shock of the robbery had begun to settle into the methodical, often grueling work of forensic recovery and intelligence gathering. Detectives found themselves staring at maps of Kent and southeast London, tracing the paths of vehicles that seemed to vanish into the gray landscape. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to break. Small, seemingly insignificant details started to surface, like fragments of a broken mirror reflecting a much larger and more terrifying image. The military precision of the raid suggested a level of planning that required a hidden infrastructure, a network of safe houses, and specialized workshops where the tools of the crime were forged in secret. One of these crucial breadcrumbs led the authorities to a modest car repair yard in Welling, a place known as ENR Cars. To a casual passerby, it was just another garage, smelling of old motor oil, rusted metal, and the heavy scent of rubber tires. But beneath the veneer of a legitimate business, something far more lucrative was hidden. It was here that Roger Coutts, a 30-year-old garage owner, operated. When police finally descended upon the yard, they were not just looking for stolen vehicles. They were looking for the heartbeat of the conspiracy. What they found was staggering. Tucked away within the confines of this industrial space was a cache of stolen cash totaling £9,700,000. The sheer volume of the banknotes, stacked and bundled, was a physical manifestation of the greed that had fueled the operation. The discovery confirmed that the gang had not simply vanished into the night. They had fractured, dispersing the wealth into smaller, manageable portions to be laundered or hidden until the heat died down. As the money was being counted, another lead was quietly developing miles away in Plumstead. This trail didn't involve heavy machinery or grease, but rather the delicate, artistic world of theatrical makeup. During the kidnapping of the depot manager and his family, witnesses had described the kidnappers as men who looked strangely artificial, their faces lacking the natural movement of human skin. This led investigators to Michelle Hogg, a 32-year-old hairdresser and makeup artist. She was an unlikely participant in such a violent crime, a woman who had studied the art of prosthetic design. On the 23rd of February, a tip-off led police to her home. There, in a mundane wheelie bin sitting outside on the curb, they found the discarded remains of a masterpiece. They pulled out scraps of latex, traces of silicone, grease paint, and dental clay. It was the refuse of a transformation. These were the materials used to create the faces of the men who had posed as police officers, allowing them to walk right up to their victims under the guise of authority. The technical skill involved in the masks was unsettling. Michelle Hogg had been paid a mere £200 for the materials, working out of her flat to craft disguises for 4 men she claimed she had never met before. The process was intimate and eerie. She had applied the latex directly to their skin, molding the prosthetic pieces to fit their features perfectly, ensuring that even under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Securitas depot, they would appear real enough to deceive. The masks weren't just simple coverings. They were second skins, complete with fake beards and structural changes to the jaw and brow. However, the very artistry that allowed the robbers to hide their identities would eventually become their undoing. Within the discarded makeup and the dental clay found in that Plumstead bin, forensic teams discovered something the gang had failed to scrub away. They found DNA. It was a microscopic signature, a biological breadcrumb that could not be burned or buried, linking the perpetrators directly to the tools of their deception. The investigation was now widening at an incredible pace, revealing a conspiracy that involved over 30 individuals. It wasn't just the men with the guns. It was the car dealers, the makeup artists, the inside men, and the family members who provided alibis. The scale was so vast that it began to feel like a small city had conspired to commit a single crime. Each new lead felt like pulling on a loose thread of a massive tapestry. In Southborough, another £8,600,000 was found in a lock-up garage. At a farm in Stapleyhurst, more vehicles were recovered. The police were no longer just looking for a gang. They were dismantling a corporation of crime. The specialized nature of the masks and the logistical brilliance of the car yards showed that this wasn't a crime of passion or a desperate act. It was a cold, calculated investment. But as the breadcrumbs continued to fall, the robbers began to realize that no matter how many layers of latex they wore, or how many millions they buried, the weight of their own mistakes was slowly pulling them back into the light. As the winter of 2006 turned toward a restless spring, the investigation into the Securitas heist began to focus on a single, formidable figure. Detectives, sifting through mountains of evidence, found themselves drawn to the underground martial arts scene of South London. This was a world of grit, where men measured their worth in blood and endurance. Amidst the whispers, one name resonated with a particular intensity: Lee Murray. He was a celebrity in a brutal subculture, known to many as Lightning. To the police, he was becoming the suspected orchestrator of the largest cash robbery in history. They saw the heist as a coached performance, requiring the discipline of an athlete and the cold calculation of a man with everything to gain. Lee Murray was a man built for the octagon. Standing 6 feet tall with explosive power, he had a reputation for a chin made of iron and hands that moved like the element his nickname suggested. His career in mixed martial arts had been a meteoric rise, culminating in a debut at the Ultimate Fighting Championship in Las Vegas. He had walked toward the cage wearing an orange jumpsuit and a theatrical mask, a display of his own perceived darkness. He won that fight, but his past followed him like a persistent phantom. Beneath his athletic success lay a history of road rage and street brawls. His fighting career was eventually cut short by legal troubles that prevented him from securing a visa, leaving him on the knife edge of society. The true turning point came on a humid night in September 2005. Outside the Funky Buddha nightclub in Mayfair, a massive brawl erupted. Murray was stabbed multiple times, suffering a punctured lung and a severed artery. As he lay on the cold pavement, he believed he was dying. He was rushed to the hospital and technically died 4 times on the operating table. When he finally regained consciousness, he wrote a single word on a notepad: warrior. This brush with death did not humble him. Instead, it stripped away his fear. During his long weeks of recovery, while his body was still mapped with fresh surgical scars, Murray began to weave the plan for the Securitas raid. He realized his fighting days were over, and he would find his fortune elsewhere. No king acts alone, and Murray had a lieutenant who was more like a brother. Paul Allen, known as the Enforcer, had been by Murray's side since their school days at Eaglesfield. They were a study in loyalty, 2 men from the rough public housing of South London who decided the world owed them more than it was willing to give. Allen was a father of 3 who projected a sense of domestic stability, yet he remained Murray's most trusted confidant. Where Murray was explosive, Allen was the steady presence who handled the logistics. Their bond was forged in the gym and tested in the streets. When the heist began to take shape, Allen was at the center of the storm, sourcing disguises, and tracking the movements of their targets with clinical precision. Together, Murray and Allen assembled a network of over 30 individuals. They recruited fellow cage fighters like Lee Russia, men who understood the necessity of physical intimidation. They brought in bouncers to handle security and an inside man to provide the intimate details of the depot's inner workings. Murray ran the operation like a training camp, demanding total commitment. The complexity of the plan, the prosthetic masks, the fake police uniforms, the kidnapping of the manager, required a level of coordination that most criminal minds could not fathom. Murray was a student of strategy, studying the vulnerabilities of the Securitas depot as if he were studying the weaknesses of an opponent in the ring, looking for any gap in the defense or a flaw in the security routine. During the robbery, Murray took on a role that earned him the nickname Stopwatch. He didn't just participate, he timed every movement with clinical obsession. He knew the window of opportunity was narrow. While his crew hauled millions in cash into the lorry, Murray stood there, the ticking of his watch a steady rhythm against the tension. He was the conductor of a high-stakes orchestra, ensuring the banknotes were moved with maximum efficiency. They were forced to leave behind over 150 million pounds simply because they ran out of space. As they drove away in the pre-dawn light of February 22nd, they felt they had truly conquered the world. The weight of the stolen millions was heavy, but the victory felt light. The immediate aftermath was a blur. Within 4 days, Murray and Allen fled toward the horizon. They crossed into France, drove through Spain, and eventually crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. In the upscale district of Suissy, they settled into a lavish villa, surrounding themselves with the spoils of their crime. They believed they were beyond the reach of the law, but the shadowy echoes of the heist were already following them. They were safe for now, but the net was quietly tightening. The dry, warm air of North Africa greeted Lee Murray and Paul Allen like a heavy silk veil. They had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, leaving the rain-slicked streets of Kent far behind, trading the gray, damp skies of England for the blinding white light of Morocco. In the capital city of Rabat, the scent of the Atlantic Ocean mingles with the sharp aroma of roasting coffee and the earthy, ancient dust of the Medina. To the world, they were fugitives, the faces on every news bulletin from London to Glasgow. But in their own minds, they were conquerors who had slipped through the net. They had vanished with a fortune that the world could scarcely comprehend, and now they sought sanctuary in the land of Murray's father. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and burnt orange, the two men settled into their new reality. They believed they had found a place where the long arm of British law could not reach, a sun-drenched fortress where the rules of the old world no longer applied. They settled into the affluent suburb of Suissy, a place of high, ochre walls, hidden gardens, and sprawling villas that whispered of old money and quiet power. Their home was a palace of marble and light, a stark contrast to the gritty, gray underworld of London they had dominated for so long. Inside those secure walls, the stolen millions began to flow like water. There were lavish parties that stretched into the early hours of the morning, fueled by expensive champagne and a sense of absolute invincibility. They purchased high-performance cars that roared through the winding streets of Rabat and adorned themselves with heavy gold and glittering diamonds. It is said they even spent thousands of pounds on plastic surgery for their partners, attempting to rewrite their physical identities as thoroughly as they had rewritten their lives. The clinking of ice in crystal glasses and the soft, rhythmic rustle of banknotes became the soundtrack to their exile. They were living a dream built on a foundation of stolen currency, unaware that the shadow they had cast in Kent was lengthening, stretching across the sea to find them in the heat. While Murray and Allen enjoyed the fruits of the heist, a quiet storm was gathering. Thousands of miles away, in the bustling offices of Kent police, detectives were not sleeping. They were tracing threads of evidence, following the digital and physical breadcrumbs left behind in the wake of the robbery. The Moroccan authorities, including the elite members of the national security forces, had been alerted. Unbeknownst to the men in the villa, they were being watched. Every move they made, every extravagant purchase at the luxury boutiques, and every late-night excursion was being recorded. Undercover officers blended into the crowds at the local markets, and eyes watched through telephoto lenses from the shadows of neighboring buildings. The tension was invisible but heavy, like the humidity before a desert thunderstorm. The hunters were patient, waiting for the perfect moment when the fugitives would be most vulnerable, caught in the open and away from the security of their white-walled sanctuary. That moment arrived on a Sunday in June 2006. The setting was the mega mall in Rabat, a temple of modern consumerism filled with families, shoppers, and the cool hum of air conditioning. Murray Allen and two of their associates walked through the bright corridors, perhaps feeling at ease among the ordinary crowds. But the mall was a trap. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered as dozens of armed Moroccan police officers, their faces set in grim determination, converged on the group from every exit. The scene was chaotic, a blur of movement and shouting as the officers moved in to make the arrest. Murray, ever the fighter, did not go quietly. There was a desperate physical struggle, a final flash of the raw violence that had defined his career in the cage. But against the sheer weight of the law, there was no escape. The handcuffs clicked shut, a cold and final sound that echoed through the marble halls. From the luxury of the mega mall, they were taken to the grim, stone-cold reality of a Moroccan prison, a place of iron bars and echoing silence. The capture was only the beginning of a complex legal and diplomatic dance. The British government desperately wanted the men returned to face trial on home soil, but they soon encountered a formidable obstacle. Lee Murray was more than just a British citizen. Through his father, he held Moroccan nationality. This detail, seemingly small during the planning of the heist, now became the center of a high-stakes legal battle. Morocco, as a matter of principle and law, does not extradite its own citizens to foreign powers. While Paul Allen was eventually sent back to England in January of 2008 to face his reckoning, Murray remained behind. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, then years, as lawyers argued over jurisdiction and ancient treaties. The British authorities had to provide volumes of evidence to the Moroccan courts, embarking on what some called a proxy prosecution. In the end, the man who had masterminded the greatest cash robbery in history found himself sentenced not in a courtroom in London, but in Rabat. He was given 10 years, a sentence that would later be increased to 25 years upon appeal. As the heavy cell door closed, the sun-drenched dream of Morocco had turned into a permanent, shadowed reality. The millions that remained missing were out of reach, buried perhaps in the very red dust that now held him captive. The air inside the Old Bailey in the early months of 2008 was thick with a heavy, expectant silence. This building, with its grand stone facade and the Statue of Justice standing high above, has seen the dark heart of London's history for centuries. But the trial that unfolded in Court Number 1 was something modern and massive. It was a spectacle of law and order clashing with a crime of unprecedented scale. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the low murmurs of the gallery as 5 men sat in the dock, shielded by reinforced glass. Lee Russia, Stuart Royal, Jetmir Bukpapa, Roger Coutts, and the quiet, observant Amir Heisenaj. They were no longer the shadowy figures captured on grainy night vision footage. Here, under the bright, unforgiving lights of the courtroom, they were stripped of their masks and their bravado, facing a jury of 7 women and 3 men who would spend the next 7 months unweaving the threads of a £53 million mystery. The heart of the prosecution's case began not with the money, but with the people. When Colin Dixon took the stand, the room grew even quieter. He was a man who had been a manager at a cash depot, a man used to the steady rhythm of counting and security protocols, but his voice carried the weight of a trauma that no amount of money could ever compensate. He described the moment he was pulled over on a dark road, thinking he was being stopped by the police, only to find himself looking into the barrel of a gun. He spoke of the cold fear that gripped him when he realized his wife, Lynn, and their young son were also in the hands of these men. Lynn Dixon's testimony was equally harrowing. She described the terrifying journey in the back of a van, holding her child close while masked men threatened their lives. The jury listened as she recounted the psychological toll of being used as a human bargaining chip. For the Dixons, it wasn't just a robbery. It was the worst night of their lives, a nightmare of 1 hour and 6 minutes that would linger for years to come. As the weeks turned into months, the prosecution shifted from the human element to the technical. They introduced a key witness who had once been a defendant herself, Michelle Hogg. A professional hairdresser and makeup artist, she had been recruited to create the elaborate latex masks that allowed the gang to walk past security cameras undetected. The detail was incredible. These weren't simple store-bought disguises, but prosthetic pieces designed to alter the very shape of their faces. Michelle described the hours she spent in a hidden workshop, molding the features that would eventually be seen on the depot's security monitors. Her decision to turn Crown witness was a turning point. She walked the jury through the process of how a roofer and a car salesman were transformed into convincing law enforcement officers. The masks, intended to be their greatest protection, became one of the primary tools for their undoing. As the forensic team found minute traces of DNA on the discarded balaclavas and equipment left in the abandoned getaway vehicles. The evidence then moved into the digital realm, where the gang's meticulous planning had left behind a trail of electronic breadcrumbs. The prosecution presented an overwhelming array of cell site analysis, mapping the movements of the conspirators in the weeks leading up to the heist. It was revealed that Amir Heisenaj, the inside man who worked at the depot, had played a pivotal role. The investigators showed a specific phone call made at 38 minutes past 2 in the morning, just as the gang was fleeing with their massive haul. Jetmir Buckpapa had dialed Heisenaj's number. Though the call went unanswered, the digital handshake between the two towers proved they were in communication during the height of the crime. This connection destroyed the defense's claim that the men did not know each other. The court also saw footage of the hidden cameras the gang had used to spy on Colin Dixon's home and the depot's gates. The level of surveillance they had conducted was described as having military precision, yet for all their technology, they could not outrun the digital footprints they left across the Kent countryside. When the time came for the closing arguments, Sir John Nutting for the prosecution painted a picture of a gang motivated by pure, unadulterated greed. He spoke of the £21 million that had been recovered in raids across locations like Welling and Southborough, hidden in garages and under floorboards. But he also reminded the jury of the £32 million that remained missing, a king's ransom still out there in the world, perhaps buried or moved through offshore accounts. The defense tried to cast doubt on the identification of the men, highlighting the chaos of the night and the lack of clear facial recognition from the depot's cameras. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been transferred through innocent means, but the sheer volume of evidence, the masks, the DNA, the cell phone records, and the testimony of the victims, was a mountain too high for the defense to climb. The jury retired to deliberate, and for several days, the Old Bailey waited in a state of suspended animation. On the 28th of January, 2008, the verdicts were finally delivered. The foreman of the jury stood and, one by one, pronounced the word guilty for the primary conspirators. Lee Russia, Jetmir Buckpapa, Roger Coutts, and Stuart Royal were each given life sentences. The judge, Mr. Justice Penry Davy, looked across the court at the men and stated that they would serve a minimum of 15 years, though the reality was they were likely to remain behind bars for closer to 30. Amir Heisenaj, the man who had betrayed his colleagues from the inside, was sentenced to 20 years. The sentences were a stern message from the British justice system. The largest cash robbery in the country's history would be met with its most significant consequences. As the men were led away to the cells below, the courtroom began to empty. The legal battle had ended, but the story was far from over. Somewhere, across the ocean or perhaps hidden in the very soil of Kent, tens of millions of pounds were still waiting to be found, and the mastermind, Lee Murray, was still a world away in a Moroccan prison, awaiting a justice of his own. Imagine the sheer bulk of 32 million pounds. It is a mountain of linen and paper. When the dust finally settled on the investigations of 2006 and the subsequent trials of 2008, a staggering void remained in the story. While 21 million pounds were eventually clawed back from lockups in Welling and hidden caches in Southborough, a vast fortune simply evaporated into the cold air. It is a sum so large that it defies easy visualization. 32 million pounds, enough to fill dozens of heavy suitcases, now existing only as a ghost in the system. For the detectives, this missing wealth became a shadow they could never catch, a silent reminder of the men who planned better than they executed. Victims of that night sought a peace that money could never buy. Colin Dixon found himself and his family at the center of a life they never asked for. After the verdicts were read, the Dixons did not return to their old home in Herne Bay. Instead, they disappeared entirely. Under the protective wing of the Witness Protection Scheme, they were granted new names, new histories, and a new life on the other side of the world. In the vast, quiet landscapes of Australia, they tried to bury the memory of the cold steel of a handgun and the terrified cries of a young son. Yet, fear is a persistent companion. Even in a new country, under a different sky, the weight of the missing millions follows them, a bounty that keeps the world feeling smaller and more dangerous than it should. The search for the missing millions led investigators across borders into the sun-soaked casinos of northern Cyprus. It is here that the name Sean Lupton is whispered. A builder from Whitstable who vanished while on bail, Lupton is believed by many to be the custodian of a significant portion of the stolen hoard. Reports filter back of a man splashing cash in mountain villages, living a life of excess in a territory where British law is frustrated by the absence of extradition treaties. To his family left behind in England, he is a ghost. To the police, he is a target just out of reach. The missing money has bought him a life of hollow luxury, built on the foundations of a crime that shattered the security of a nation. The Securitas depot, once the fortress of the local cash economy, could never quite shake the stigma of its breach. The security industry was forced into a painful period of self-reflection, overhauling protocols that had been exposed as vulnerable. Eventually, Securitas exited the cash handling business entirely, selling the facility to a consortium of major banks. The building on Vale Road remains, but its spirit is different now, guarded by thicker steel and more complex digital eyes. The cost of the investigation nearly rivaled the amount of money recovered, with millions spent on a global manhunt that spanned from Morocco to the West Indies. We are left to wonder about the nature of that missing 32 million pounds. Does it sit in a damp cellar beneath a Kentish field, or has it been laundered into the red bricks of Mediterranean villas? Money of this scale has a way of changing shape. It becomes property, influence, and eventually it becomes untraceable. It is a haunting thought that somewhere that stolen cash is still circulating, passing from hand to hand, oblivious to the terror it once caused. The heist was a masterclass in planning, but a tragedy in its human cost. It proved that while you can lock a man in a cage, you can never truly lock away the consequences of a night where every rule of safety was broken. The story of the Securitas heist is one of immense numbers and intimate terrors. It is a tale of a mountain of cash and a family forced into the shadows. As we leave the empty vaults and the distant shores of Cyprus behind, we recognize that some mysteries are never meant to be fully solved. The missing millions will likely remain just that, missing, a legend of the underworld that grows more distorted with every passing year. Our journey into the shadows of 2006 comes to an end. The cold air of the vault is gone. The echoes of the heavy doors have finally faded. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.